During a courthouse hearing, a pregnant woman is pushed down a flight of stairs. The incident captured on security cameras. As the footage is analyzed, a web of lies and manipulation unravels, with shocking secrets about the true culprit. And as the truth begins to surface, a battle for justice threatens to destroy everyone involved, with revelations no one saw coming. If you enjoy stories like this, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. The New York County Supreme Court was especially busy that Tuesday morning. Leah Miller adjusted, her tan blazer over her 7-month baby bump, as she walked down the main corridor of the building. Her steps were cautious, measured with the natural care of someone carrying a new life. Beside her, her husband, David Carter, maintained a neutral expression, his eyes glued to his phone as if he were in a completely different world from this important moment. Today's hearing would decide the future of an employment lawsuit that had been dragging on for months. Leah was a witness in a case involving the company where she had worked until the beginning of her pregnancy. She knew her testimony would be crucial, that her words could change the course of everything. Nerves tightened in her chest, but she took a deep breath, remembering the advice her brother Ryan had given her the night before. Ryan Miller was a respected attorney, known for his relentless pursuit of the truth in the most complex cases. Although he wasn't representing Leah in this specific lawsuit, he had insisted on accompanying her to the courthouse. He was a few feet behind them, talking to a colleague, but his watchful eyes never strayed far from his sister. The courtroom was on, the 3rd floor. Leah held onto the handrail of the staircase, preferring to climb slowly rather than risk the crowded elevator. David finally put his phone away and offered his arm, a mechanical gesture that seemed more for show than genuinely supportive. She accepted, but felt a strange pang in her heart. In recent months, since she'd found out she was pregnant, something had changed between them. David had become distant, cold, as if he were dealing with a problem instead of celebrating the arrival of their first child. When they reached the 3rd floor, Leah saw other people also, waiting for hearings. There were lawyers with their leather briefcases, nervous witnesses flipping through papers, and a few curious onlookers who frequented the courthouse for reasons she couldn't comprehend. Among these unfamiliar faces, one caught her eye. A woman in a red dress, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant bun, was staring intently at her. There was something unsettling about that gaze, an intensity that made Leah instinctively look away. Ryan caught up to them just then, placing a protective hand on his sister's shoulder. He also noticed the woman in red, but didn't think much of it. At first, the courthouse was packed. It was natural for people to watch each other while they waited. He checked his watch and sighed. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock. They still had 15 minutes. Leah sat on one of the benches in the hallway, feeling the weight of her pregnancy on her legs. David remained standing, once again absorbed in his phone. Ryan frowned as he watched his brother-in-law, but decided not to say anything. It wasn't the time for family confrontations. The minutes ticked by slowly. Leah closed her eyes, trying to calm her nerves. She thought about the baby growing inside her, how all of this would just be a distant memory once her child was born. She pictured herself holding the little one in her arms, far from the cold, formal environment of the courthouse. The image brought her a moment of peace. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened. A court officer called out the names of those involved in the lawsuit. Leah stood up carefully, smoothing her dress. Ryan came closer, whispering words of encouragement. David finally put his phone away, but his face remained expressionless, like an impenetrable mask. They started walking toward the courtroom. The hallway, previously buzzing with side conversations, seemed to fall silent. Leah felt all eyes on her, including the piercing gaze of the woman in red, who was now closer, also heading for the same room. Was she part of the same case? Leah didn't remember seeing her in the prep meetings. As they passed through the doorway, the woman in red quickened her pace, strategically positioning herself next to Leah. The hallway narrowed at that point, forcing people to pass in almost single file. That's when it happened. So fast that almost no one noticed the initial movement. The woman in red raised both hands and, with surprising force, shoved Leah in the back. The scream echoed through the hall before Leah's body even hit the floor. She tried to catch her balance, her hands desperately reaching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion for Ryan, who was just a few steps away. He saw the look of panic on his sister's face, saw her hands instinctively shield her belly, saw the impact against the cold marble floor. Chaos erupted instantly. People rushed in from all directions. Ryan was the first to reach Leah, kneeling beside her. She was conscious but in shock, her eyes wide with fear, her hands still clamped to her stomach as if she could protect the baby from any external harm. David was frozen for a few seconds, as if he couldn't process what had just happened. When he finally moved, it was with a disconcerting slowness, like he was walking through quicksand. Ryan noticed, but he didn't have time to think about it. His priority was his sister and the niece or nephew she was carrying. A court officer was already calling for an ambulance on his radio. Other courthouse staff were trying to control the scene, pushing back onlookers, creating space. The woman in red had stepped back a few paces, but remained there, watching. Her face showed no guilt or concern, just a calculated neutrality that made Ryan's stomach turn. Leah tried to speak, but the words came out in broken gasps. She was pointing in the direction of the woman in red, trying to communicate something important, but the shock prevented her from forming coherent sentences. Ryan held her hand, telling her to stay calm. That help was on the way. It was then that David finally knelt on the other side of Leah, but his words were unexpected and disturbing. Instead of comforting his wife, he muttered something about her being fine, that it probably wasn't serious, that she'd always been a bit dramatic. Ryan's head snapped up, and he stared at his brother-in-law with a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. Before he could respond, the paramedics arrived, pushing a gurney through the now crowded hallway. They began to assess Leah, asking questions about the fall, checking her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone present held their breath, waiting for some sign that mother and child would be okay. Ryan stood up, his eyes scanning the corridor. He was looking for the woman in red, but she had vanished into the crowd. Or almost. He spotted her leaning against a distant wall, speaking quietly with a man in a grey suit whom he recognized as a courthouse employee. The conversation seemed urgent, whispered, conspiratorial. Something wasn't right. Ryan could feel it in his gut, that sharp intuition he'd developed over years of dealing with lies and manipulation in courtrooms. That fall hadn't been an accident. The push was deliberate, intentional. He had seen the woman's two hands against Leah's back. But why? What was the motive for attacking a pregnant woman in the middle of a courthouse? The paramedics started moving Leah onto the gurney. She was crying softly now, not from physical pain, but from fear for her baby. Ryan held her hand again, promising that everything would be okay, that he would take care of everything. David watched the scene with that same empty expression, like a disinterested spectator at a play. As the gurney was wheeled toward the elevator, Ryan made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go. He wouldn't allow whoever was responsible for this to get away with it. He turned to the court officer who had witnessed the scene and, in a firm, authoritative voice, demanded that all security footage from the hallway be preserved immediately. It could not be erased, edited, or tampered with in any way. The officer hesitated, clearly surprised by the demand, but Ryan was already presenting his attorney ID, citing statutes and legal procedures. He knew exactly how to handle these situations. His experience in complex cases had given him tools he would now use to protect his family. The woman in red watched everything from a distance. Her face finally showed a crack in its mask of neutrality. There was concern there, maybe even fear. She whispered something to the man in the grey suit, who nodded and quickly walked away, disappearing through a side door. Ryan noticed the movement but couldn't leave Leah's side. He followed the gurney to the ground floor, where the ambulance was waiting with its doors open. David trailed behind, silent, his hands in his pockets. As the paramedics began to close the ambulance doors, Ryan said he would meet them at the hospital in a few minutes. He had to take care of something urgent first. David offered to ride in the ambulance, but his voice lacked conviction. Leah, even in her fragile state, noticed. Her eyes met her husband's for a moment, and in that look was a silent question, a doubt that was beginning to sprout. Why wasn't he more worried? Why did he seem almost relieved by the chaos around him? The ambulance pulled away, its siren cutting through the New York morning air. Ryan stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the vehicle disappear. Then, with renewed determination, he turned and walked back into the courthouse. Ryan climbed the courthouse stairs with firm, determined steps. His mind was racing, connecting dots, forming strategies. He had to act fast before any evidence could disappear. He knew all too well how things worked behind the scenes of the justice system. He knew that influential people had ways of making trails vanish, of turning truths into convenient narratives. When he reached the third floor again, the hallway was being cordoned off. Yellow security tape marked the area where Leah had fallen. 2 court officers were talking to witnesses, taking preliminary statements. Ryan approached, identifying himself professionally. He explained that he was the victim's brother and an attorney, and that he had the right to observe the proceedings. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair, nodded respectfully. Ryan was well known in this courthouse. His reputation preceded him. The officer explained that they had already initiated standard protocol for this type of incident, including collecting statements and preserving the security footage. But Ryan wasn't satisfied with standard protocols. He insisted on speaking directly with the head of the Security Monitoring Center. He wanted to see the footage with his own eyes to ensure nothing would be altered or conveniently lost. After a few minutes of negotiation, the officer agreed to take him to the security room. As they walked through the building's inner corridors, Ryan asked about the woman in red. The officer consulted his notes and informed him that she had identified herself as Patricia Adler, an attorney present at the courthouse for a hearing unrelated to Leah's case. According to her, the fall had been an accident, the result of Leah unexpectedly tripping over her own feet. Ryan felt anger boil in his veins, but maintained his composure. He knew the game. Patricia Adler was building her defense from the very first moment, planting a narrative that would absolve her. But he had seen the push. He had seen her 2 hands against Leah's back, the deliberate, forceful movement. It was no accident. The monitoring room was small and filled with screens displaying different angles of the courthouse. A security technician was sitting at the console, organizing the day's files. Ryan introduced himself and explained what he needed. The technician seemed nervous, his fingers trembling, slightly over the keyboard. They began to review the footage. Ryan asked to see all the cameras covering the third-floor hallway, especially those near the courtroom. The technician typed a few commands, and the images started appearing on the monitors. Ryan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screens. There it was, the complete sequence of events. The footage showed Leah walking down the hall, David by her side, Ryan a few steps behind. Then, Patricia Adler entered the frame, quickening her pace to get next to Leah. The camera angle was perfect. It clearly showed the moment Patricia raised both hands and shoved Leah with force. Ryan asked the technician to pause and zoom in on the scene. The image became even clearer. There was no doubt. It was an intentional, calculated push. The technician swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with what he was seeing. Ryan demanded that he make immediate copies of the footage and store them in multiple secure locations. While the technician worked on the backups, Ryan noticed something odd. The man kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. There was sweat on his brow, and his hands continued. Toe shake. Ryan narrowed his eyes, his lawyer's intuition warning him that something was wrong. Before he could question the technician, his cell phone rang. It was the hospital. Leah had arrived and was being examined. The doctors wanted to speak with a close relative. Ryan said he would be there shortly, but first needed to ensure the evidence was secure. He hung up and turned his attention back to the monitors. It was then that he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the footage from a few minutes before the incident, Patricia Adler appeared talking to the man in the grey suit Ryan had noticed after the fall. The conversation was clearly intense, though the audio wasn't captured. And then, to his shock, David appeared in the frame, briefly joining their conversation. Ryan paused the image. David? His brother-in-law knew Patricia Adler. He knew the man in the grey suit. Why would he be talking to them moments before the hearing? The questions exploded in his mind like fireworks, each one more disturbing than the last. He asked the technician to identify the man in the grey suit. After checking the courthouse employee registry, the technician reported that it was Mark Taylor, a court clerk who had worked there for over 10 years. Ryan made a mental note of the name. He would need to investigate the connections between these three people more deeply. The technician finally finished making the backups. He handed Ryan a flash drive with the recordings and confirmed that additional copies were stored on secure servers. Ryan tucked the device into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, thanked him, and prepared to leave. But before opening the door, he turned back to the technician. He looked him directly in the eye, and in a low but firm voice said that he expected that footage to remain intact, that any attempt at tampering or disappearance would be treated as obstruction of justice. The technician nodded quickly, sweat now visibly running down his face. Ryan knew his message had been received. As he left the monitoring room, Ryan almost collided with Mark Taylor, the clerk in the grey suit. The man seemed surprised and uncomfortable with the encounter. He tried to step aside, but Ryan politely blocked his path, introducing himself. Mark responded with a hesitant handshake, his eyes constantly darting away. Ryan casually asked if Mark had witnessed the incident. The clerk replied that he had, that it was terrible, but that apparently the lady had tripped. Ryan noted how he avoided using Leah's name, keeping her an anonymous, distant figure. It was a common technique of emotional dissociation, something guilty people do to lessen the weight of their actions. When Ryan mentioned that he had seen footage of Mark talking with the accused before the incident, the man turned visibly pale. He stammered something about only knowing her professionally, that she was a fellow attorney. Ryan didn't press the issue at that moment, just smiled politely and said they would probably talk again soon. He left Mark standing there, clearly rattled. Ryan then headed to the hospital. During the cab ride through the bustling New York streets, his mind wouldn't stop working. There was a conspiracy here, that much was becoming clear. But what was the goal? Why would anyone want to hurt Leah? What threat did she represent? The cab pulled up in front of the hospital. Ryan paid quickly and entered through the ER. After identifying himself at the front desk, he was directed to the second floor, where Leah was being examined. David was sitting in the waiting room, once again absorbed in his phone. When he saw Ryan, he stood up, but his expression was hard to read. Ryan asked about the condition of Leah and the baby. David replied in a monotone voice that the doctors were still running tests, but that there were apparently no immediate signs of serious trauma. He spoke as if he were reporting the score of a baseball game, without any genuine emotion. It was then that Ryan decided to confront him. He asked directly about his conversation with Patricia, Adler and Mark Taylor before the hearing. David froze, his eyes finally showing some emotion, fear. He tried to deny it, but Ryan was already showing him a picture on his phone that he'd taken of the monitoring screen. The image was clear. David sat down heavily in one of the waiting room chairs. He ran his hands over his face in a gesture of defeat. After a long silence, he began to speak. He admitted he knew Patricia from years ago when they worked together at another company. He said she had recently contacted him wanting help with something related to the case in which Leah was a witness. Ryan felt a tightness in his chest. He told David to continue. His brother-in-law explained, his voice trembling, that Patricia represented powerful interests that would be harmed by Leah's testimony. She had offered David money to convince Leah to change her story, or at worst not show up for the hearing. The revelation hit Ryan like a ton of bricks. David had been complicit in an attempt to obstruct justice. Worse, his own pregnant wife was the target, and he had agreed to be part of the scheme. Ryan had to restrain himself from losing his composure right there in the middle of the hospital. Before he could respond, a doctor emerged from one of the exam rooms. She called for the family of Leah Miller. Ryan and David approached immediately. The doctor explained that Leah was stable, that the baby was fine with a normal heartbeat. However, she had suffered some bruising and would be kept for observation for at least 24 hours as a precaution. Ryan sighed in relief, but his anger toward David only intensified. He asked to see Leah. The doctor consented, but said only one visitor at a time. Ryan went in first, leaving David in the waiting room. Seeing his sister lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, he felt a mix of relief and renewed fury. Leah opened her eyes when she heard her brother's footsteps. Her eyes were red from crying, but she tried to smile when she saw him. Ryan held her hand, telling her everything was okay, that she and the baby were safe. He promised he would uncover the whole truth and make sure those responsible paid. Leah whispered something about having seen the push, about being sure it wasn't an accident. Ryan confirmed that he had seen it too, and that he already had the proof he needed. He explained about the recordings, about the evidence he was gathering. He saw a mix of gratitude and worry in his sister's eyes. Then Leah asked about David. Where was he? Why hadn't he come in to see her? Ryan hesitated. He didn't want to overwhelm her right now, but he also knew she deserved the truth. He decided he would tell her everything, but only when she was stronger, more recovered. In the following hours, Ryan worked tirelessly. While Leah rested in the hospital, he was making calls, consulting with colleagues, gathering information. He discovered that the employment lawsuit in which Leah was a witness involved a major corporation accused of serious labor violations. The company had illegally fired dozens of employees, and Leah, as a former human resources manager, had information that could prove the allegations. Patricia Adler, as Ryan found out through some quick research, was an attorney for this corporation. She had a history of using questionable methods to defend her clients, always skirting the ethical boundaries of the profession. There were rumors, never, proven, of bribery and witness intimidation, but never anything as direct and violent as a physical assault. Ryan was in his office, surrounded by papers and documents, when he received an unexpected call. It was Mark Taylor, the court clerk. His voice was shaking on the phone, revealing extreme nervousness. He said he needed to talk, that he had important information, but that he couldn't do it over the phone. He wanted to meet in person. Intrigued and cautious, Ryan agreed. They arranged to meet at a discreet coffee shop, far from the courthouse and prying eyes. Ryan arrived early, chose a table in the back where he could watch the entrance. When Mark walked in 20 minutes later, he looked like a hunted man. His eyes constantly scanned the room, and he sat with his back to the wall. After ordering a coffee he barely touched, Mark started talking. He explained that he had been coerced by Patricia Adler. She had compromising information on him, evidence of minor irregularities he had committed years ago at the courthouse. Nothing serious, but enough to ruin his career and reputation. Patricia had used this to force him to help her. Mark's role was to ensure that the security footage of the hallway was erased after the incident. He had access to the monitoring room and knew the technician in charge. The plan was simple: make the footage disappear, turning the deliberate push into an accident with no reliable visual witnesses. But Ryan had gotten there too quickly, demanding the copies before Mark could act. Ryan listened to it all in silence, his expression unreadable. When Mark finished, he made it clear that this confession wouldn't absolve him of his actions. However, if he was willing to cooperate officially, to testify against Patricia, Ryan could help him minimize the legal consequences of his involvement. Mark agreed immediately. He was remorseful, scared of the repercussions, and desperate for a way out. Ryan formally recorded his statement, ensuring every word was documented. Now he had not only the footage, but also an insider's testimony of the conspiracy. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Leah received an unexpected visitor. Patricia Adler appeared in her room, holding a bouquet of flowers and wearing a practiced expression of concern. Leah's blood ran cold when she saw her, but before she could call for anyone, Patricia began to speak quickly. She said she was there to apologize for the terrible accident, that she felt responsible for being so close when Leah tripped, that she wanted to make sure there were no hard feelings. Her words were syrupy, her voice soft, but her eyes were cold and calculating. Leah knew a predator when she saw one. With a firm voice, despite her internal nervousness, Leah replied that it was no accident, that she had felt Patricia's hands deliberately push her, that there were witnesses and certainly recordings. Patricia maintained her smile, but something dangerous flashed in her eyes. Then the mask slipped. For a moment, Patricia leaned closer, and in a low but clear voice said that Leah should rethink her involvement in the employment lawsuit, that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when you had so much to lose. Her eyes dropped meaningfully to Leah's belly as she said it. The threat was clear. Leah felt tears of anger burn her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She replied that the truth was always worth it, no matter the cost, that she would not be intimidated or silenced. Patricia straightened up, left the flowers on a side table and walked out of the room without another word. As soon as the door closed, Leah grabbed her phone and called Ryan. She told him about the visit and the veiled threat. Ryan felt a burning fury take hold of him. Patricia had crossed every line. Not only had she physically assaulted his sister, but now she was openly threatening her. This would not go unanswered. He immediately contacted the police, presenting all the evidence he had collected, the security footage, Mark's statement, Leah's testimony about the threat. He built a solid case not just for assault, but for witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. As the legal process began to unfold, Ryan decided it was time to confront David more directly. He found his brother-in-law still at the hospital, sitting alone in the waiting room. David looked older, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his guilt. When he saw Ryan approach, he tried to look away. Ryan sat next to him and, without beating around the bush, demanded the whole truth. He wanted to know exactly what the deal with Patricia was, how much money was involved, and if David had any idea about the plan to physically harm Leah. David vehemently denied the last part. He swore he never imagined they would go that far, that he thought it would just be psychological pressure. But he admitted he had accepted a significant amount of money, $20,000 to be exact. The money was to be delivered as soon as Leah dropped her testimony or changed her story. David explained that they were struggling financially, that the baby's arrival brought expenses they couldn't cover. He tried to justify his betrayal with economic need. Ryan listened with growing disgust. He asked if David understood that he had sold out his own wife's integrity, risked her life and the life of their unborn child. David hung his head, tears finally streaming down his face. He said he was a coward, that he was sorry, that he didn't know how to fix what he had done. Ryan was silent for a long moment. Then he said that David would have to confess everything to Leah, that she deserved to know the whole truth no matter how painful, and that, depending on how he handled it, there might still be a chance for redemption. But if he continued to lie, to hide, to minimize his actions, Ryan would personally ensure he faced every possible legal consequence. David agreed, but asked for a little time. He wanted to wait until Leah was stronger, more recovered. Ryan accepted, but set a deadline, 24 hours. After that, if David hadn't told her, Ryan would. That night, Ryan went back to the hospital to stay with Leah. She was calmer, the monitors showing that both she and the baby were stable. They talked about trivial things at first, trying to normalize the atmosphere. But then Leah asked about David again. Ryan hesitated. It still wasn't the time to reveal the full betrayal, but he could start laying the groundwork. He said that David was involved somehow with the people who had attacked her, that he had been manipulated, but that he had also made some questionable choices. Leah listened in silence, and Ryan could see in her eyes that she already suspected something. She confessed that in recent months she had noticed changes in David, secretive phone calls, unexplained meetings, a growing emotional distance. She had tried to blame it all on the stress of the pregnancy and their finances, but deep down she knew there was something more. The confirmation of her suspicions, though painful, brought a strange sense of relief. Ryan held his sister's hand and promised that no matter what happened, she would never be alone, that he would take care of her and the baby, that the truth would be revealed and justice would be served. Leah smiled faintly, thankful to have a brother like him. In the following days, events accelerated. The police opened a formal investigation into Patricia Adler. The security footage was presented as indisputable evidence of the attack. Mark Taylor testified about the conspiracy to destroy evidence. The pressure on Patricia mounted with each passing hour, but she didn't give up easily. She hired a team of expensive lawyers who began to build a defense based on discrediting Leah. They claimed she was emotionally unstable, that her pregnancy made her prone to exaggeration and drama. They tried to argue that the footage was inconclusive, that it could just show an unfortunate accident. The game had gone public. Journalists began covering the case, fascinated by the story of a pregnant woman attacked in a courthouse. Public opinion quickly turned against Patricia. Spontaneous protests were held in front of the courthouse with people demanding justice for Leah. The corporation Patricia represented tried to distance itself from the scandal. They issued a statement claiming her actions were personal and unauthorized, but Ryan knew it was a lie. He had evidence that the payments to David came from corporate accounts. He was building a case that would implicate not just Patricia, but the entire corrupt corporate structure. The morning of the third day brought an unexpected twist. Ryan was in his office reviewing documents for the afternoon hearing when he received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was distorted, clearly altered by some app. The person claimed to have crucial information about the case, but would only reveal it in person. Normally, Ryan would be more cautious with this kind of approach, but something in the urgency of the voice, the insistence that there was much more at stake than he imagined, made him agree to a meeting. The chosen location was a public park, in broad daylight, surrounded by people. A safe place for both of them. Ryan arrived 15 minutes early. He sat on a bench near a playground watching the children play as he waited. When the person finally appeared, Ryan was genuinely surprised. It was a woman in her 50s, well-dressed, with a leather folder under her arm. She introduced herself as Helen Rogers. Helen sat next to Ryan and, without preamble, began to speak. She explained that she worked as an accountant for the corporation Patricia represented. Over the past few months, she had uncovered a massive scheme of corruption and fraud. The illegal firing of the employees was just the tip of the iceberg. There was embezzlement, tax evasion, bribes to public officials. Leah, as the former HR manager, had started to suspect some irregularities before she was fired. She had kept documents, made copies of incriminating emails. The corporation knew this and was desperate to silence her before she could testify in the employment lawsuit. The attack in the courthouse wasn't just about intimidation. It was about physically incapacitating her from attending the hearing. Ryan listened to it all with growing disbelief. He asked why Helen was revealing this information now, risking her own safety. She replied with tears in her eyes that she had a daughter Leah's age who was also pregnant. When she saw what had happened on the news, she couldn't live with the silence anymore. Her conscience wouldn't let her remain complicit in such evil. Helen opened the folder and handed Ryan a series of documents. They were financial spreadsheets, bank statements, internal emails, forged contracts. It was a goldmine of evidence. Ryan quickly leafed through them, his experienced attorney's eyes immediately recognizing the legal value of the material. With this, they could not only prove the conspiracy against Leah, but bring down the entire corrupt structure. He thanked Helen profusely and promised to protect her legally as a witness. She nodded, but made it clear she was scared. These people were powerful, with resources and connections. Ryan assured her he would use all his experience to keep her safe. He went straight back to the hospital, where Leah was about to be discharged. He found her sitting on the bed, already in her own clothes, waiting for the final checkup. David was there too, sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, a tormented look on his face. Ryan knew the moment of truth had arrived. Leah looked at her brother, and then at her husband. She asked David to tell her what was going on. She said she deserved to know everything, that they couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. David took a deep breath, his hands shaking, and began his confession. He told her about Patricia's offer, about the money, about the pressure to get Leah to drop her testimony. He admitted his cowardice, his greed, his betrayal. He said he never imagined they would go so far as to physically assault her, but that he knew he was involved in something wrong from the start. He asked for forgiveness, knowing he might not deserve it. Leah listened in silence. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't sob. There was a dignity in her pain, a strength that impressed even Ryan. When David finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a clear, firm voice, she said she needed time, that she couldn't just forgive and forget something so serious, that David had put not only her at risk, but their unborn child. David accepted, clearly shattered. He said he would understand if she wanted a divorce, that he would accept any consequence for his actions. But he begged for the chance to prove he could change, that he could be the husband and father they deserved. Leah didn't answer. She simply asked him to leave the room, that she needed space. After David left, Leah collapsed into Ryan's arms. She cried all the tears she had held back during the confession. Ryan held her, letting her release the pain and anger. When she finally calmed down, she asked what she should do. Ryan replied that the decision about her marriage was entirely hers, but as for the lawsuit and justice, they were going to see it through to the end. He then showed her the documents Helen had provided. He explained the magnitude of the corruption they were up against. Leah was shocked but also determined. She said she wouldn't back down, that she would testify not just for herself, but for all the workers who had been wronged by that company. The hearing was rescheduled for the following week, giving Leah time to recover completely. In the meantime, Ryan worked intensely to prepare the case. He organized all the evidence, coordinated the testimonies of Mark and Helen, and ensured the security footage was officially admitted as evidence. Patricia Adler tried to negotiate a deal. She offered to withdraw from representing the corporation in the employment lawsuit in exchange for the assault charges being dropped. Ryan flatly refused. There would be no deals, no negotiations. Justice would be served in full. On the day of the rescheduled hearing, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every available space, cameras ready to capture every moment. Public opinion was inflamed. Everyone wanted to see how the case would resolve. Leah arrived with Ryan, walking with her head held high despite her nerves. David was there too, keeping a respectful distance, but showing silent support. Patricia Adler was accompanied by her legal team, all wearing calculated expressions of confidence. But Ryan could see the nervousness behind the professional masks. They knew the evidence was overwhelming. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Ryan presented his case meticulously. The security footage was played, clearly showing the deliberate push. Mark Taylor testified about the conspiracy to destroy evidence. Helen Rogers revealed the extent of the corporate corruption, and Leah, in a firm, clear voice, gave her testimony about the irregularities she had witnessed at the company and the attack she had suffered. Patricia's defense tried to discredit the evidence, to argue that it was all a misinterpretation of the facts, but every argument was methodically dismantled by the evidence presented. The recordings didn't lie. The financial documents didn't lie. The multiple witnesses all corroborated the same story. Then came the most dramatic moment. Ryan presented a final piece of evidence he had strategically saved, an audio recording of the threat Patricia had made to Leah in the hospital. Leah, as a precaution after the intimidating visit, had left her phone recording in secret. Patricia's voice was unmistakable, her threatening words echoing through the silent courtroom. The impact was immediate. Patricia's confident expression crumbled. Her lawyers looked stunned, clearly not expecting that revelation. The judge called for a recess to review all the evidence presented. During the recess, Ryan noticed a strange flurry of activity. Representatives from the corporation were having urgent, whispered conversations. Phones were ringing constantly. Something was happening behind the scenes. When the hearing resumed, one of the company's executives asked to make a statement. To everyone's surprise, he announced that the corporation was firing Patricia Adler immediately and withdrawing from any legal defense related to the case. More than that, they were willing to acknowledge the labor violations and negotiate reparations with the former employees. It was a complete capitulation, clearly motivated by the fear that the full extent of their corruption would be publicly exposed. But Ryan wasn't satisfied with just that. He insisted that Patricia face the consequences for her individual actions. The judge agreed. Based on the evidence presented, he ruled that Patricia would be prosecuted not only for assault, but for witness intimidation, attempted obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. As for David, Ryan had separately presented his involvement in the scheme to the authorities. However, given his cooperation and genuine remorse, and considering he had no prior knowledge of the intent to physically harm Leah, it was agreed that he would face alternative sentencing and community service, in addition to restitution of the money he received. Leah watched it all with mixed emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also sadness for the betrayal she had suffered. When it was all over and the judge adjourned the session, she allowed herself a moment of relief. Ryan hugged her, telling her how proud he was of her courage. In the days that followed, the story had wide-reaching repercussions. The corporation faced federal and state investigations. Several executives were implicated in the corruption scheme. Reforms were promised, policies were changed. The case became a landmark in the fight against unethical corporate practices. For Leah and David, the path was more complicated. They started couples therapy, trying to rebuild the shattered trust. There were no guarantees they would make it, but they were both willing to try, especially with the baby's arrival approaching. David demonstrated genuine remorse through concrete actions, striving to become a better person. 3 months later, on a sunny Saturday morning, Leah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Ryan was in the hospital, waiting room when David came out to give him the news. There were tears in his eyes, but they were tears of joy and gratitude. He said they had decided to name the baby Helena, in honor of the brave woman who had helped bring the truth to light. Ryan smiled, moved. He asked to see his niece, and when he entered the room, he found Leah radiant, despite the exhaustion of labor. She was holding little Helena in her arms, looking at her daughter with infinite love. When she saw Ryan, her eyes shone with gratitude. She thanked her. Brother for everything he had done, for never giving up on the search for truth, for protecting her when she needed it most. Ryan replied, that's what family was for, that he would always be there for her. He looked at little Helena and made a silent promise to always protect this child, to ensure she grew up in a world where justice and truth prevailed. Months later, on a quiet afternoon, Ryan was in his office when he received a letter from Helen Rogers. She was writing to thank him for the legal protection he had provided and to let him know she had started a new career as a corporate ethics consultant. She would use her experience to help other companies avoid the mistakes she had witnessed. She said the case had changed her life, given her a renewed purpose. Ryan put the letter away with a smile. Cases like this reminded him why he had chosen to practice law. It wasn't just about winning cases or making money. It was about making a difference, about fighting for the truth, even when the path was difficult. As for Patricia Adler, she faced trial and was found guilty on all charges. She received a significant prison sentence and had her law license suspended indefinitely. Her career, built on questionable methods, had completely collapsed. It was a reminder that, eventually, consequences catch up to those who choose the path of dishonesty. Leah's story became well known not just in New York, but across the country. She was invited to give talks on courage and resilience. Her testimony inspired other people who had suffered injustice to speak out, to fight for their rights. She embraced this role, using her experience to help others. David continued his process of redemption. He worked hard to rebuild Leah's trust, to prove he was worthy of being the father Helena deserved. It was a long and difficult road, full of challenges and setbacks. But he persisted, and slowly, very slowly, the family began to heal. Ryan watched it all with cautious satisfaction. He knew the journey of healing is never truly over, that emotional scars take time to fade, but he saw progress, he saw hope, and that was enough. He continued to be a safe harbor for Leah, a devoted uncle to Helena, and even offered guidance to David when needed. The courthouse where it all began implemented new security protocols. The cameras were upgraded, and procedures for witness protection were revised. The case had exposed vulnerabilities in the system, and steps were taken to correct them. It was a positive change born from a terrible situation. On a Sunday afternoon, almost a year after the events at the courthouse, the family gathered to celebrate Helena's first birthday. It was a simple, intimate party, with just close friends and family. Leah looked around, seeing Ryan playing with Helena, David helping set the table, and felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She walked over to Ryan and thanked him again, not just for the legal battle, but for believing in her when it seemed no one else did, for being her rock when everything was falling apart. Ryan hugged his sister, telling her he would always be there. That's what family meant. As they cut the cake and sang happy birthday to Helena, who clapped her hands happily without fully understanding what was happening. There was a feeling of a new beginning in the air. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be overcome. The truth had prevailed, justice had been served, and now it was time to look forward, to build a better future on the lessons so painfully learned.